Jack, how do you become the reference of a niche without having been the typical avatar of the person you interview on the show?
Okay, that's a great kickoff question for someone like me.
Jack Sweeney, a seasoned journalist and the host of CFO Thought Leader, has spent over a decade uncovering the untold stories of finance leaders.
From breaking barriers as a non-CFO to becoming a trusted voice in the financial world, Jack brings a unique lens to the evolving role of leadership.
All these experts and very finance people think they can step in and, do wonderful interviews. Why? You're not trained to do that.
You mentioned that there was kind of a breaking line between 2020 and everything before in terms of podcasting.
A lot to cover there, but I'd love to share it. It's something I've observed up close clearly. And
there is something that I want to challenge you on, Jack. So in the previous conversation, you told me, hey, more and more CFOs are preparing to become CEOs.
I do believe that we're seeing greater frequency of CFOs stepping into CEO roles.
Why did you choose this specifically, Jack? Why finance?
A lot of people were doubtful, like, why did you pick CFOs? They're so boring. I have over 300 videos of CFOs. And I have career lessons and lessons that go back in time. I don't see myself as an influencer. Again, I'm struggling with that because I see myself as a...
Jack, how do you become the reference of a niche without having been the typical avatar of the person you interview on the show? How do you do that?
Yeah, wow. Okay, that's a great kickoff question for someone like me. Well, I've been a journalist and I've been a business journalist. So I have regularly interviewed executives for more than 30 years, all types of executives. And so there was a familiarity with what I would call a rapport. And of course, the podcasting world, it's, journalists make up a slice of it. We all come from all different walks of life. And it's interesting. I feel like many other podcasters without a journalism background, they're stealing my technique. That's what I do. That's what I'm trained to do. So in a way, I think I'll flip it on you. Why did they, all these experts and very finance people think they can step in and, do wonderful interviews? Why? You're not trained to do that. So it depends what side you want to look at. But to be perfectly honest, I was a little nervous. Like everyone else, I had imposter syndrome. I'm not a finance expert, and of course, I interview CFOs. But I had spoken to quite a few leaders over the years, and I had a comfort level with doing it. And I think that's how I slipped into it rather easily, I think.
So the kind of objection, if I can call it that way, that we had for many people trying to get into podcasts is like, oh, but when I listen to a podcast, I want the interviewer to be able to relate to the person they are interviewing, to put themselves in their shoes, right? I want them to be experts as well, so they can actually extract the juice of the expertise from the interviewee because they've been there before themselves, which makes for a much more compelling interview. Obviously, anybody that tells me that now, I should just send them to your podcast because you're the reference in the CFO space. And it is not true. You haven't been a CFO. So to dig a little bit further into this, Jack, how do you develop the skill set or how do you grow into being somebody who whispers at the ears of the CFOs without having been one before, which is not obviously a bad thing and maybe brings a different light, right? Which makes this whole interview thing works well. How do you do that?
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, I'll what I just shared about being someone who's interviewed executives, right, C-suite executives for a very long time. I have sort of and again, this works for me. It might not work for everyone, but I'm not looking to bond with the CFO. I'm not looking for a business opportunity when we get off. And you know what? They know that because I've already been vetted. They've had someone look into who he is, and they're like, this is Jack. He doesn't sell CFO fractional services. He doesn't sell software No, I do have sponsorships, but frankly, I just want a good interview. And I do think I have a professional approach, which is I open up and I always say, hey, thank you for your time. I appreciate it because this is hard. And you know what? Most CFOs they have better things to do, but they have a media team or a public relations team who has put this on their calendar and said, hey, this is worth doing. So then they have to, because they're collaborating. They want to demonstrate they understand. And I'll point out that wasn't always the case for podcasts. And I put the dividing line really around 2020 and COVID. I would always be reaching out to CFOs trying to bring them on. And it wasn't the type of media opportunity they were interested in. But after COVID, there's been a real, I would call it a willingness to participate in more forms of media. And then we all know the media landscape is changing so quickly. So anyway, I take a professional approach. I am, and in many ways, I think I'm very polite with them and sensitive to their time. And they know that I'm not going to try to shoot the breeze with them and sort of bond with them. I'm here to get as good an interview as you can get. So let's do it together. And I do have sort of a pep talk at the start where I say, hey, we have a short time together and I have so many questions I want to ask you. So let's do it,
Okay, there is so much to unpack in here. First of all, because now you mentioned it, Jack, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come on this show, Jack.
That's good.
So, a few things I want to explore. First thing is, as one of the first things that you mentioned, you don't have anything to sell. Why is that important?
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's important in journalism. I mean, you needed the objectivity, you need the, and so it's always been part of journalism. But in terms of them, because, what's on the back end of this? Okay, yeah, I'll make time for Jack, but I see he sells this software or this application. What do I don't want to come off as if I'm endorsing it. Is that, there are conflicts that we are not even aware of. And certain companies have to be concerned about that. So, again, I make very clear up front that this is an editorial operation. And by that, I mean it's church and state. I do have sponsors, but, I'm not going to ask you about their products. If you bring up those products, that's different. You want to talk about them, that's fine. But I don't come on the air and ask you specifically about those applications. And again, for communication folks who are often involved and go to bat for us, and I have a lot of respect for, I have to tell you, if not for the communication professionals, many of these doors I've opened, would remain closed. And so they're sticking their neck out a little bit. In part, they're doing it because they know that it's all what they see is what they get. He's a journalist. He might like something on social media, but that'll be the last engagement you have unless you come back on the show.
I love that. So just for information, Jack is not endorsing any company behind this podcast. Just making that precision.
So I love them all, but I'm not endorsing them here today.
Right. That's important. So, no, and I get that, right? You want people to feel comfortable coming and having a discussion with you. And if there is any unclear background around the interview, you might be like, but there might be something behind it. So I get that. The other thing that you mentioned, Jack, which is very interesting, which applies to, I guess, the CFO world, because this is where you are, but potentially to much, much more industries as well. You mentioned that there was like kind of a breaking line between 2020 and everything before in terms of podcasting and how easy it was to get some guests. That's also something we discussed in our pre-brief call. Can you elaborate a bit on this? And like, what's the whole story, right? When you started in 2014, which is like 10 years ago now, how have you been evolving into this podcast world with like the difficulty of getting guests on the show, especially CFOs only? What has changed in 2020 and what's the impact now?
A lot to cover there, but I'd love to share it. It's something I've observed up close, clearly, and as I explained, people who know my past, I was in print, B2B print business magazines. My last magazine was something called Business Finance Magazine. Mm-hmm. I had been at that just 3 years, and yeah, it was clearly a magazine designed for senior finance executives. But it was print, and I used to write these long stories. None of it was short format, really. But as the ad dollars dried up, I went looking for another opportunity or business or what it was. And podcasting, and again, we're going back to 2011. Podcasting had been around a while, but it seemed to be gaining momentum. And it's not something I take too naturally. Again, I did ask questions, but it's funny. We all hear ourselves record it, and I'm horrified, like everybody else sometimes. My use of language, how I,
It's all right.
sentence fragments, I don't complete thoughts, but it's all part of communication. But, this was my style of reporting. It was always kind of rapid, and it didn't always translate well to podcasting, where the listener would like to hear a little more from each person, I suppose. But podcasting was on the radar, and I decided the timing was perfect for CFOs. And this is, I think, a little insider information. We had gone to conferences, over the last decade and a half, where finance conferences, where there was always a venue or a panel discussion around the changing role of the CFO. And within the C-suite, there's probably, I would argue, the finance leadership role has broadened more than any other role, meaning finance is at the table in HR today. It's at sales decisions. It's involved in all the functional areas. And finance leaders needed to connect with these different constituencies in a more meaningful way. Their professional narratives, they can't just say, okay, it's the earnings call, and that's it. You get me once a quarter. I come on and I talk about the numbers. That's it. No. So my idea was to create more of a well-rounded interview that would allow them, to talk about their career history, because finance leaders need to attract talent. But, help us to share a few anecdotes along the way back during your Price Waterhouse days. What is the piece of advice you'd give that person today? And just try to all the segues as they came up. So that's what I call a professional narrative, your professional career narrative. And then we have where they talk about their business. And this is what I found a little troubling at first. Finance leaders didn't have a passionate way of talking about what their company does and what's their business opportunity. Again, when you're accustomed to talking about profit margins and investments and raising capital, it's all about the numbers. That's all that mattered. It didn't matter how you illustrated to someone the service or product. But that is finance leaders absolutely need to be able to do. It's like they're always raising money now. Get us excited about your company. But many of them just were not able to do that. And then, we have a set of personal questions that I ask on sort of the last 10 minutes of the podcast, which they really never did. Let's reflect a little on the personal side.
Do you have an example of that?
That was, all types of things. I mentioned to you, before getting on, we were interviewing a CFO in Tel Aviv. What's one thing most people might not know about you? And frankly, he grew up in until 8 years of age, he lived in Kenya, and it's just I got a little bit of detail there as to why his parents were involved in the infrastructure and building roads and what have you. But it's just people share all sorts of things, which I think is wonderful, and we're all kind of intrigued by the individual, not just the company. So this is a long way of saying finance leaders needed to connect with more constituencies. And how do you do that? By sharing more stories, making them more four-dimensional, 5-dimensional individuals. So the podcast could really serve a need. And part of what I was setting out to do too was, look, there's plenty of venues to talk to your investors. This is going to be something entirely different. And just to reflect a little more on CEO leadership is always in the past been thought of as visionary leadership. The CEO got to share the big story, the big picture, and the finance leader was over here with the numbers. Well, more increasingly, finance leaders have had to become more visionary leaders, sharing some of that big picture, getting people excited about where things are headed. And I think the intersection with podcasting at that place in time where you had finance leaders eager to explain themselves in different terms and podcasting taking off was what I enjoyed anyway at the first part. And forgive me, it was very difficult to bring guests on because initially, to answer your question, in part because it wasn't a well-established media opportunity. Some CFOs will tell you, oh, Wall Street Journal, I'll speak to them. And there was always this sort of food chain of media. Well, the media landscape has changed drastically. So that worked in our favor as we went along as well. But it was still quite challenging. There were a lot of public relations and communications people who were forward-thinking and would encourage their clients to experiment with different types of media, thankfully. And many of them really helped me build that podcast during the early days.
What's the agenda of a CFO coming on your show? I'm asking this because, so you mentioned people are booking this for them, right? CFOs are obviously very busy people. So they are taking this time out of their day to not do something else potentially. Why is that? Why would a CFO from a, $500 million plus company come on a podcast? And I think it would be interesting to reflect on this back in 2014 versus now.
And it's some of what I was just sharing.
Mm-hmm.
They want to demonstrate that they're dynamic leaders. They want to demonstrate a dynamic leader is one that connects with many. Someone who leaves the room and people remember them. Mm. So if you want to step up and demonstrate that you're capable of leading across the organization, not just an accountant, frankly. Come on the podcast and engage our audience. Come on and be engaging, be dynamic, and someone who thinks on their feet. Somebody who's flexible and again, it's interesting, Jim, and in the podcasting world, we know this. Part of it is how you and I engage each other, isn't it? And you get a read on the host and actually the guest if they're able to relate to Jack and they're actually answering his questions and treating that with a level of respect as you would in a private conversation. And again, I know if I have an episode that takes a wrong turn, it's because there's a CFO who's kind of talking past me and sharing, and I'm trying to get them to engage and answer my questions. But finance leaders who are media savvy, who are dynamic, who think on their feet, who answer Jack's questions, it's a demonstration of how confident and how prepared they are to lead across their organization. Across the organization, you're going to meet all sorts of people. You have that person in IT who's brilliant, but, he is just not that social that you need to build a relationship with because, frankly, they're demanding this huge IT investment, and you're going to have to measure that in some fashion that, the greater organization can understand. I don't know what it might be, but today you've got to go out there as a finance person and build these types of relationships that weren't necessary in the past.
So that piece you just said about the audience being able to relate and potentially answer to Jack's question the same way the guest is, the whole reason Hussam and I got into this podcasting game is we were listening to a podcast called Modern Wisdom from Chris Williamson, one of the biggest now. But I'm talking about years ago, about 4 years ago actually. And Chris would interview more and more amazing guests. And something that we loved about Chris, and both Hussam and I were reflecting on this. Chris asked follow-up questions that we were asking ourselves 5 seconds before he asked it.
Yeah.
This guy is able to be so present in the conversation that obviously he potentially has a script whatsoever. But I'm it would be super interesting to know this.
Presence of mind.
And then he would ask it.
No, the presence of mind skill is so important. And it's something I have to work on as well.
Interesting.
I have a standard format. I'm always thinking I got to get to the next thing, and I'm not always present. So I think it's something that all of us need to be really realize. It's about being present when you have the person there. 10 minutes from now, it's not going to matter.
100%. So how would you, that's super interesting. How would you approach that as a new, not a new skill to learn, but a skill to develop for you who's been doing podcasting for 10 years now, right? How would you go about improving your hosting skills?
You know, one of the most painful things that a podcaster can do is you might be editing an episode or listening to a past episode and you realize you're not present. It's you. You're blowing it. So how do you correct that? And you know, just sort of the irony here is one of the key skill sets that finance leaders always suggest that they have is it's about being a good listener. And even in finance, and that's very believable because, again, finance people are not the big talkers. They leave that to other functional areas. They're usually the precision people. But stepping back into our world, Guillaume, I have found it challenging. And again, because I'm so sensitive to the person's time and the things I want to get to, I am guilty of not always being present, as engaging. So you got to be very thoughtful as to the steps to take for that. It is really hanging on the individual's words, and it's focusing on it. I don't have any tricks about it, but just a reminder for myself. I'm like, okay, and I start hanging on each word. It's a little closer focus, closing the aperture, so you have that presence. You got to close the aperture. You got to stop thinking about what you want to ask five minutes from now. It's challenging.
It is, and so I'm far from mastering that craft, I think.
Yeah.
A few recommendations I would have, though, for me, who's also trying to develop that skill more, is being overly prepared helps. Like knowing in and out your guests, their craft, their company, and so on, so that you don't have to find that out during the episode itself. And you might not even talk about your guest's background or your guest's company or what they are doing on a day-to-day. Well, at some point, it's probably the topic of the podcast as well. But like being overly prepared allows you to then focus 200% on the conversation. That's my feeling, at least. And the other thing is, and that's something we've noticed with Usam, our first podcast, we had, as you mentioned here, Jack, everything scripted. Like the question one by one, and we knew we had to go through all this. We even had some guests who were just reading their answers, very poorly performing episodes. And for Podcast Gurus, the direction we've taken is that, hey, we're going to have a few bullet points that we're not even going to send to the guest. You're total witness to this, Jack. And that we're just going to go through, and then we're going to build a conversation based on this. That helps a lot, I feel. So there is something that I want to challenge you on, Jack. And it's about this whole CFO thing. And in the previous conversation, you told me, hey, more and more CFOs are preparing to become CEOs, right? Like the transition happens that way. Is that so? Did I recall properly, or did you say it in a different way?
I do believe that we will see, we're seeing greater frequency of CFOs stepping into CEO roles. I don't have any number. My data's but that's been a trend that we've been seeing. And I would tell you that as CFOs become more visionary leaders, we're going to see more of that. And I guess that's my clarification, if I have one.
Yeah, 100%. So that's super interesting. So I was reading an article about, I don't remember what exactly, but the topic was around, hey, like 50, 100 years ago, when you had to grow a company, it was like capital companies, right? You were investing heavily into an industry, building a factory out of the ground, and you had to manage all those assets and, get the best return on investment possible, which was a very CFO, a very financial linked function. It's like, how do we make those assets to produce yield results? When you look at more recent companies, the Apples, the Googles, the Nvidia, right? All those companies, they are more like product-based. Dare I say marketing-based. Steve Jobs was just an absolutely amazing marketer. So I would actually have thought that the trend would go the other way around. Like, it made sense before for companies to go from CFO to CEO. Now it's maybe more CMO to CEO, and that's absolutely not based on any facts nor study. It's just my complete feeling. Or even maybe COOs, right? When you're in the day-to-day of the company, then you're probably best fit to direct it.
What are your thoughts on that, Jack?
I think it's interesting because we see all paths leading to top leadership in mid-sized companies and in a lot of tech companies. And we know this. There's a common role in a tech company today is a chief revenue officer.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of industry doesn't even know what's a chief. Of course, that's sort of the top sales. Often it's the top sales role, at least in my way of thinking. Yeah, there's a group of executives that are very familiar with each other's roles. In some of these companies, again, you have a $15 million company and they together take it to a $500 million company. And by the time, they all graduate from that company, they really do have a good sense of each other's contribution and leadership qualities and how they contributed to the bigger equation, which was a great exit, or what have you. So there is crossover from CMOs. There is crossover from, I've seen chief revenue officers become CEOs, all these C-suite positions. But finance is not being left behind, which surprise many people because, again, go back 20, 25 years, they were the bean counters, and it's been oversaid and overdone, but they were more or less accountants.
No, that's an interesting way to frame it. And actually, it's true that when we think about big companies, it will be, big tech companies. But you have what represents, I think 61% of the jobs in the United States are from companies of less than 200 employees or something like this. So actually, what makes the most out of the economy is not the big ones. And this is where you can get potentially CFO transitions to CEOs. Why did you choose this specifically, Jack, and not the CMO thought leaders or the CEO thought leaders or the whatever C-suite thought leaders? Why finance?
And again, it would have been because I was attending those types of conferences for the last 3 to 4 years.
Okay.
I had befriended a number of consultants in the space, had connections. I would tell you, though, a lot of people were doubtful, why did you pick CFOs? They're so boring, and again, it would have been a lot funner to talk to. And it is funny because I will tell you that finance accounting conferences were nowhere near as fun as HR conferences or talent acquisition. The HR people have a lot of fun. That's not the finance people don't. But there is, you do, and of course, marketing folks, highly expressive people, or we're led to believe, and the sales team, oh my gosh, they know how to party. So the finance people are the ones who, have to be concerned about risk management and what have you. Not the people you want to. Not everyone thought it was a great idea. Yeah.
And so, what kept you going, nonetheless?
You began to build an audience, and that was very exciting. And it was very exciting to me. And from year to year, I experienced growth and I could chart it. And I'd have bad months. Again, it's a fever line, and you get discouraged. But from year to year, there was definite growth. It was exciting. It was something, back in 2015 and 2016. I was one of the few in the space, let's say, who were regularly interviewing CFOs twice a week. Got a little more crowded now.
Did you go twice episode a week from the get-go?
No, I was more ambitious. I tried to go three a week. And I cut it back. And 2, I even found hard. Like I said, starting out, it was very difficult I had to do a lot of outreach, a lot more pre-calls. And we did a pre-call, but I don't do pre-calls.
Oh, really?
Why not? I don't do pre-calls.
That's a good reason.
It might be, it would make for a better show. But and again, and I think you're aware of this, I do soup to nuts. I do everything. And I have in the past created ebooks and other types of offerings associated with my sponsors. And I would hire contractors and bring in people to help me execute under those circumstances. But for the platform, I've always been lone wolf. So I had plenty of things to occupy my time, I guess. And the CFOs themselves didn't necessarily want a pre-call. Again, their time is... So I did develop what I think were some strong prep materials, and I did it early. I think we all over time develop prep materials, and I would spend more time maybe with the communications people and make myself very accessible to them. But if you're dealing with C-suite executives, communications people are in the mix. Every once in a while, I'll do a CFO who reaches out to me directly. But to be honest, I don't even necessarily like that because the communications person will coach the CFO in terms of how the relationship works. Because you'll get off and the CFO goes, well, send me the episode. I don't want it going out until I listen to it. Frankly, I don't let anybody listen to our episodes before they go out.
Really?
Yeah. No one gets that. So
Why
and
not?
I make that clear from the upfront.
Why not?
Because again, when you're publishing on a regular schedule, I don't want any commitment that prevents me from and they would. C-suite executives, believe me, how they rank my podcast is, down there. And you know what? I'm really busy until next Thursday. I'm going to do nothing but work on this in this conference room with my team. And, sorry, Jack, I'll get back to you later. No, if you're coming on the podcast, I'm going to release it according to my schedule.
Interesting. I mean,
C-suite executives would be very demanding that way if given the opportunity.
Are you not closing a lot of doors to yourself doing this? Like, the reason I'm asking this, Jack, is because our first podcast, Corporate Treasury 101, we ended up interviewing the group treasurers, which is like directly reporting to the CFO, big people at banks, for instance. It's impossible to get an episode out. At least we felt it was impossible to get an episode out. Obviously, it's not the truth because you managed to do it with people even above them. But we even had recordings with the communication person in the recording itself. So are you not closing yourself a lot of doors doing this? Saying, hey, no, you come on the show, you take it as you live it or whatever you say in English. Don't you think?
Long-term way, no. There will be some that. But again, Dan, with me, it's very black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Because, again, I'm taking a journalistic posture. No, you don't see my story before it goes out. And you will not listen to the episode before it gets released. It's an editorial approach that I've kept in place. Communications people, again, the majority of them understand it. Now, the podcasting world, they know the podcasting world is not like the traditional journalism print magazine world or newspaper world. They know that.
Yep.
So a lot of communications people are willing to do it differently. And if there's a creator who is not a journalist and wants to do a pre-call and, they'll ask for certain conditions back, I'm sure. With me, they know I can't ask for Jack won't agree with that. He says that up front. Yeah, and he never does.
Yeah. Super interesting. So do you still have a guest issue now? Or do you have enough people in the pipelines to be like, yeah, now 2 episodes a week is absolutely not an issue?
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting, again, we talked a little bit about middle market businesses.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a Fortune 500. I interview mostly middle market CFOs in high growth companies and have from the start. And that was deliberate because the middle market, I find it really a very innovative space, clearly. So many of the tech companies that grow out of it, it's really a lot of dynamic business models. Now, Fortune 500 CFOs are great, and I bring them on. I might get one a month. So there's probably a dozen a year. And to be honest, those episodes perform very well. Very often they come to me. I'm not doing all the outreach, and that might surprise some people. If I was saying, okay, I'm just going to do a show of Fortune 500, that might get a little challenging because there's a lot of hoops you have to, I think, jump through with their communications people and their teams. They're a little more concerned. And I do make a special effort for them, but I don't release the episode beforehand for them.
Okay. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So, Jack, you've been a bit of a, dare I say, visionary. You started as a journalist. You switched to podcast before it was cool, but then you position yourself perfectly for when the wave was coming. What's next? What's the next Jack Sweeney's move? And which medium should we look into?
Well, and I know you're very aware of this, and if anything, I'm a little bit of a latecomer to YouTube and video. This is a face made for video. It's not my choice or medium. However, I do believe short form video, we've seen it. It's taking off. TikTok is just exploding. LinkedIn is moving into video. I keep on going to YouTube and LinkedIn and seeing you pop up instantly, by the way.
Here we go.
I'm not, and it's funny. I have, I'll tell you what I have. I have over 300 videos of CFOs. Nobody has that as far as I know right now, just because I've done so many of these. And I have career lessons and lessons that go back in time. So I've only just begun doing this in the last 30 days. And particularly I'm doing it for LinkedIn, where I'm going and opening up my archive and doing one a day, 160-second, I call it a leadership minute of a different CFO. That's Saturdays and Sundays as well. And I'm just producing that regularly. I'm curious where I'll be. I've done a lousy job with social media. I'll be honest with you. It's not. I do enjoy. I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit, and I've created. I have a company page for CFO Thought Leader, as well as a personal page. I never developed I don't see myself as an influencer. Again, I'm struggling with that because I see myself as a journalist, and being an influencer is something, it's different. It's just, so I'm trying to find sort of a happy compromise there, if such a thing is possible. You see these influencers putting up these photographs of themselves and giving you all this detail. Mm-hmm. Yeah, about their personal lives. It's not like I'm a super private person, but it's just I don't take to it naturally, let's say. I'm gonna experiment there and try to get out there more to build those types of connections that I've been encouraging CFOs to build. Likewise, I have to sort of reveal more of myself or where I think things are headed. I do think leadership lessons on LinkedIn makes a lot of sense. I think YouTube is a whole different arena, a whole different algorithm. God help us. Haven't been able to really crack that. Haven't really spent too much time thinking about it. But I'm late to the game there because other podcasters just immediately incorporated it, turned back the clock, and a great place for discovery. I've heard all the same, been on to some of the same presentations, and I do think it'll be part of our future. So something more I'm paying close attention to. I just started uploading to Blue Sky and X, and since I'm creating this 1-minute video each day, I've got to leverage it across all the platforms. So it's got to go to all the platforms. I know I just talked about LinkedIn, but that's really what it's been designed for. But I'm gonna take it to all these other platforms as well.
So Jack, believe this or not, I didn't know Blue Sky. It looks very much like Twitter. It's literally a copy of Twitter, no?
Well, it's kind of, I think only in the last 30 days, it's got a lot of headlines and people are talking about it. I think of it more as just yeah, exactly. It's like Twitter. I'm sorry, I called it X. No,
I should call it X. You're the one who's right, actually. It's X. You're right.
It's funny. I just see that big black X now. I no longer see the bird. Yeah, it's like Twitter. It actually has its colors, right? It's the old Twitter colors. Blue. So yeah, I've begun and I don't know what's happening there. I'm getting TikTok. If anywhere I have momentum, it's on TikTok. And again, it's only recently, so I'm surprised by the level of engagement. So it just tells you how large that platform is, because I'm hoping these are finance people or accounting people who want to follow me, but who knows?
Absolutely love that. So social media, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X are in your radar then. And TikTok, because you're getting huge engagement there.
Absolutely. Oh, there's a piece of this too. I should mention something's happening in investor relations. We know that. We have CEOs, and this has been on other podcasts. CEOs and CFOs are now creating videos themselves and putting their earnings in a more interesting and, creating, entertaining videos around their earning reports and statements. They're putting music behind them. And they're releasing them on YouTube and in these same channels that we're talking about. So investor relations is really being retooled. And it's interesting, in most companies, the IR folks and the communication folks, they're not always connected. That IR person is attached to the CFO, is really attached to finance. But do they meet? And we know this. You visit a site, and I know this from trying to invite a CFO to come on. I never go through the IR door. It's a waste of time. I go through the PR people or the communications door, the press door. And that's where, but you know what? Now more than ever, the IR folks and the communication folks need to be connecting internally. And the other disconnect is social media. Oh my gosh. Too often in these organizations, B2B, business organizations, their social media team, it's usually, frankly, a low-level individual who is checking the feed and how these decisions are made. A lot of communications people still don't, it's beneath them or something to, they're not taking social media seriously. It's just like a print editor who didn't take the website seriously for a very long time. Maybe we need to do more here. So it's there are disconnects in business. Technology companies tend to be the most advanced in making those connections, whether it's IR to communications to social media. But, we have a good view into that world, and it's clear the disconnects are still present.
Amen to that. Jack Sweeney, ladies and gentlemen. Jack, if people want to know more about you, your podcast, or engage with you, where should they go?
Well, we're at CFOThoughtLeader.com, of course, and we're on, and I'll put Spotify first.
Here we go.
Not Spotify, but we're at Spotify and Apple, and you'll find us on YouTube and LinkedIn. Come and follow me on LinkedIn. Give me some pointers as to how to build my followers. I'm up to something like 12,000. I got a ways to go.
Sounds like you want to become an influencer, Jack. But that's just my take. We'll put all the links in the description. Jack, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Guillaume, thank you for the time.
Of course.